Thank you again for being here for our closing keynote of this year's fall conference. It has genuinely been an incredible 3 days. My heart is really full, meeting friends old and new. As we approach the end of our time together, it is my sincere hope that the amazing presentations we've heard these last 3 days will animate all of us well beyond the confines of this weekend. So with that in mind, we would like to end tonight with one final reflection on our theme of living tradition. As a reminder, we invite you to use our QR code on all the screens, so if you haven't scanned that, please take a moment to do so now so you can submit your questions online, which I'll then pose to the speaker as time allows. Now to introduce this evening's speaker. It's a true honor and privilege to be joined this evening by my friend Zena Hitz, who teaches across the liberal arts in her role as tutor at St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. In 2018, she was a visiting fellow of the DeNicola Center for Ethics and Culture, during which time she wrote her extraordinary book, Lost in Thought: The Hidden Pleasures of an Intellectual Life. Lost in Thought explores the meaning and value of learning for its own sake, through images and stories of bookworms, philosophers, scientists, and other learners, both fictional and historical. She writes and speaks about liberal education and the life of the mind, and what it means for educational institutions to take these pursuits seriously. She studied at St. John's College, Cambridge University, the University of Chicago, and Princeton before teaching philosophy at McGill University, Auburn University, and University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Hitz also spent 3 years living and working in the Madonna House apostolate and has taught in prison programs to other non-traditional students. She's the founder and president of the Catherine Project, which seeks to build communities of learning based on conversation and hospitality. When she's not teaching or speaking, Hitz spends time thinking about topics like the moral decline and fall of individuals and communities, as depicted in stories from Genesis to The Godfather. Tonight, Professor Hitz will be offering a talk entitled Traditions of Prudence. Please join me in welcoming Zena Hitz.
Thanks, Jenny, for that wonderful introduction. There's a piece of this story which I'm not sure she knows, which is that the original piece of writing, my first piece of public writing, out of which Lost in Thought grew, was presented at this conference 10 years ago, almost exactly. And I loved the conference so much, and I thought, I'll be back here every year, and it's nice to be back, even if I had to wait 10 years to do it. And I'm very grateful to Carter for his ingenuity in bringing me here as a visiting fellow for that writing time. And tonight I'm going to be presenting some work which, like the work I presented 10 years ago, is new. So I'm very grateful to have such a wise and experienced audience who can help me to make it better than it already is. This work grew out of some scholarly work on Aristotle, that on the connection between the ethics and the politics. And I have been working on this for some time, and at the same time also reflecting on our poorly governed institutions, especially small institutions. And it suddenly occurred to me that these things might be able to be connected with one another, and so that these questions about the connections between Aristotle's ethics and politics might have a broader kind of interest. And as is my tendency, I took that as an invitation to poke around as broadly as possible. Okay. One of the oldest of our traditions about prudence or practical wisdom, I'm going to be using those words interchangeably, is the Hebrew Bible. And I'm thinking especially of the stories of the patriarchs, Joseph, and the lore about David in the book of Samuel. Abraham is our father in faith, but he is also a canny operator, and his abilities to be a canny operator drive the stories. He survives in hostile regimes by pretending his wife is his sister. When he and his nephew Lot first settle in Canaan and their shepherds of their various flocks come into conflict, Abraham offers his nephew the first choice of land, avoiding what might have been inevitable conflict and bitterness. When Lot and the local kings are defeated and captured by rival kings, he fights off the enemy with his own men and rescues Lot. At that moment, Abraham refuses payment from the local kings, accepts no reward, so refusing to become a vassal to them or indebted to them. He purchases land for his wife's grave, leaving a foothold in the Holy Land for his descendants, to which the land has been promised to return to. Even Abraham's hospitality to the three angels which foretell the destruction of Sodom shows evidence of prudence, since these angels he welcomes bear the threat of destruction by fire and brimstone. So being kind and hospitable to them is a very smart thing to do, even if that's not why he does it. Isaac seems not to inherit his father's canniness, but it is passed through Rebekah to their son, Jacob. Jacob deceives his brother from his birthright and then is schooled in deceit by his uncle Laban, who switches out Jacob's promised bride for her less appealing sister. Jacob wins his own back and more, and he leaves Laban's home with sizable riches in wives, children, and in livestock. Knowing that he may meet a vengeful Esau, it's amazing how detailed the Hebrew Bible is with these things. And these details, I think once they're seen as a sort of teaching about prudence, make a lot more sense. He organizes his train into two columns so that not everything will be lost if Esau attacks him. He travels alone so as to spare his family from any violence. And he plies Esau with gifts, so he sends all this cattle ahead in the hopes that this will placate him, soften his heart. And yet they have a tearful reconciliation, one of the most beautiful in literature, so far as I know. But even so, Jacob maintains his distance from Esau with a cautious and healthy mistrust. Jacob's favorite son, Joseph, shows his heritage as an operator once he arrives in Egypt as a slave. He rises to the top wherever he is. He finds his way to the prominent position wherever he lands. We all know people like that. His providence and his wisdom save Egypt famously from famine. We are accustomed to seeing Joseph as morally upright, and that's just in part because he suffers unjustly from his brothers and from the wife of, what's his name? Potiphar, that's right. But a careful reading reveals ambiguities, and here I've learned quite a lot from Leon Cass's wonderful book on Genesis, for those of you who don't know it. It's certainly quite imprudent, if not distasteful, to tell one's brothers that one has a vision of one's own vast superiority, like the moon and the stars. Leon Cass notes further that once he becomes part of Pharaoh's household, he becomes a real Egyptian. He refuses to eat with his brothers because they're Hebrews when they come to visit. That's the Egyptian custom. And he uses the famine as a pretext to take all of the land of the Egyptians for the pharaohs, making them all serfs. So he has a double-edged type of cleverness and success. The story of David and Samuel is also a saga of ingenuity and prudence. He wins his fame by killing a terrifying giant, Goliath, by device. He wins King Saul's favor, as well as his envy and hatred, and he manages to survive somehow, always, Saul's violent outbursts. When he lives as an outcast, he carefully, my worst nightmare. Restraints, there we go. Perfect. Okay, only one page out of order. I meant to number them. That would have been so smart. Okay. That would have been prudent. Yeah, the jokes just write themselves. Okay. So when David lives as an outcast, he carefully restrains his use of violence and wins the support of the king's son. He wins the love of his people, and he also wins their commitment to worship the Lord, his great love. So in its tales of survival by hook and by crook, the Hebrew tradition has parallels in ancient Greece. Homer's Odysseus is the most famous and obvious. After winning Troy by one of the greatest devices in history, the fake horse with soldiers inside, after that, Odysseus escapes numerous perils, witches, monsters, sirens, hunger, treacherous seas, and he ends stranded without resource on Calypso's island. He wins, once he departs, is able to depart the island, he wins over his hosts, the Phaeacians, by his storytelling. He leaves laden with gifts from them, and so is able to return home without the shame of destitution. The Odyssey consists in a meditation on the moral ambiguity of his journey, so it's not a naive praise in any way of this type of devious personality. For a king to return home penniless with all the companions he set out with dead is a disgrace. It's cause for deep suspicion. So he must not only survive, get home alive, but he must also recover his honor. Furthermore, he has to test his countrymen, the local people, including his own family, his wife, lest he meet the fate of his comrade in arms, Agamemnon, who was murdered on his doorstep upon returning from Troy. The moral ambiguity of Odysseus is a recurring theme in Greek literature. It's evident in Homer, as I say, and one other example of one of many is Sophocles' Philoctetes. In the Philoctetes, the Greek warrior Philoctetes has been abandoned on an island thanks to a snake-bitten foot, so he can't walk. So he's been left for the whole duration of the war in Troy on this island with an injured foot. He's lived in solitude for 10 years. Odysseus enlists the son of Achilles, Neoptolemus, to steal the bow of Heracles, which Philoctetes holds in his possession, and which is prophesied as necessary to conquer Troy and end the war. The son of Achilles, Neoptolemus, at first agrees to deceive and steal from Philoctetes, but as he gets to know him, he comes to recant and to pity his circumstances. He offers Philoctetes, towards the end of the play, friendship without condition, and offers to travel with him either home or to Troy as he chooses. And Philoctetes wants to go home. He doesn't want to fight with Odysseus and all the other lousy people who betrayed him earlier. So we have a problem where the treatment of Philoctetes with dignity and friendship and openness and transparency seems to be in tension with something which everyone wants, which is the taking of Troy. And this problem, apparently, can't be resolved in the context of the play without a classic deus ex machina. Okay? So Heracles appears on the stage and tells Philoctetes to go to Troy. He agrees, play ends, problem solved. One possible interpretation that comes up, I think, regularly and is impossible to dispel is that Odysseus, desperate for a resolution to this problem, appears as Heracles himself in a final, decisive ruse. One other, I think, very beautiful source help in ways of thinking about prudence is in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound. This will be my last literary venture. So if you're bored of me telling you stories from great literature, you'll be freed soon, and there'll be some philosophy. I know that that's what you're all waiting for. Okay. Aeschylus presents in Prometheus Bound a sort of origin story for the human capacity for survival by device, by tricks, or by tools. Prometheus notices that the gods have left, according to his own story, he notices that the gods have left human beings naked and without any natural resource that other animals have. They have no claws, they have no fur, they're the most helpless animals you could imagine. So he gives them fire, which is stolen from the gods, and he teaches them the arts. As he puts it, he found men witless and gave them the use of their wits and made them masters of their minds. He describes men before this condition. Men at first had eyes to no purpose. They had ears, but they did not hear. Like the shapes of dreams, they dragged themselves through their long lives. They lived like swarming ants in holes in the ground, in the sunless caves of the earth. These men that Prometheus finds are ignorant of house building, woodwork, the movement of the heavens, boats or sea travel, the arts of numbers and of letters, all of which Prometheus gives to them. Earlier in the play, Prometheus describes his attempts to interfere in the battle of the gods and the giants, which takes place before, of course, the creation of man and the animals. So he describes the gods beginning to quarrel, because Zeus is trying to win control. And Prometheus describes himself as trying to counsel the Titans, the giants, the children of the sky and the earth, but he can't persuade them. He says, they despised ingenious stratagems, and in the pride of their strength, they thought they could retain control with ease by brute force. But my mother, Themis, also called Gaia, had more than one prophesied to me, Prometheus talking, how the future would come to pass, saying that it was destined that the victors should be those who excelled not in might, nor in power, but in guile. Might and power also appear in the play, personified as the people who bind Prometheus to the rock at the beginning of the play. So Prometheus represents the human capacity to resist necessity by the use of the mind rather than by brute strength. And here are two traditions, the Hebrew Bible and the Greek one, find a meeting point. When David goes out to meet Goliath, he's a fraction of Goliath's weight and height. He has no sword or shield to protect him. And he claims the favor of the Lord, of the God of Israel. Yet the sign of the Lord's favor is surely his weapon, a sling that he has used to defend sheep from wolves. It is both a simple and effective device, and one which levels the brute force of Goliath and makes him subject to the small, unarmed, otherwise, David. So surely here too we are meant to see the power of guile in the sense of tricks, stratagems, and artfulness in the interest of overcoming brute strength. Likewise, the stories of the patriarchs are of men with households in effect completely isolated from the protection of any kind of government, overlord, or king. They survive by their wits in an environment governed by brute strength, arms, and wealth, and their ability to attain these is limited. The Egypt in which Joseph learns to flourish It's a sophisticated and powerful place. It's the peak of civilization. At time, it's presented that way in the Hebrew Bible. It's very much unlike the shepherding family in which he was raised, a family accustomed to the use of violence, as well as the extensive use of devices and stratagems. Consider the plot of Joseph's brothers to deceive and kill the rapists of their sister Dinah, or the apparent machinations of both Reuben and Judah to save the life of their hated brother Joseph from their other brothers. So Reuben's strategy, which is to leave Joseph in a pit in the desert until he can come back later and return him to his hostile brothers, is obviously inferior to the strategy of Judah, which spares Joseph's life and gets him out of the way of harm. So it seems to me that in both of these ancient traditions, we see an image of the virtue of prudence, or something like prudence. We'll get into how it's like and unlike it later. We see an image of the virtue of prudence as providing human beings with a means and survival and the means of flourishing in hostile environments. Hostile environments, lest we forget, are both common and various. The natural world, the sea that the Odysseus must cross, for instance, present one kind of hostile environment, one kind of challenge. Monsters like the Cyclops or giants like Goliath present another. And hostile political bodies, whether cities led by armed bands or nations ruled by military forces or jailers, can also present obstacles to both life and to livelihood. We human beings, as a general matter, survive by our wits. So these kinds of stories, the stories of surviving by hook or by crook, seem to me extremely widespread, extremely popular, especially with children. I think, for instance, about the story of Scheherazade in the Arabian Nights, who tells stories in order to keep her head from cutting off. She's so good at telling stories, right? She eventually wins the love of her husband. That's a case of, in the face of violence, someone using their wits to ward off what would be inevitable doom. And as a young person, I certainly was, and I think I still am, enchanted with stories about, say, the evasion of criminals. Stories of how to preserve one's life or property in the face of violence. In a family legend, in my family, my aunt escaped a mugger by saying, "When I get scared, I throw up." Another family friend advised me when I was young that if I was ever felt uncomfortable, I should put on strange or crazy, unhinged behavior. I often, especially back when I was teaching regular philosophy, would often teach the famous example of Kant, from Kant, where the murderer is at the door seeking your friend. And I've wondered whether the best tack might be to ask, knock, knock, knock. Yes, I'm looking for your friend. I'm a murderer. Is there something on your shirt? Oh, gotcha. Or, is your refrigerator running? Some other silly or strange hijinks. I'm also reminded of Hobbes' account of the equality of all human beings. Hobbes argues that all human beings are roughly equal because each of us has the power of life or death over each of the others, thanks to the variety of devices that make murder possible. Here's Hobbes. Nature hath made men so equal in the faculty of body and mind, as that though there be found one man, sometimes manifestly stronger in body or of quicker mind than another, when all is reckoned together, the difference between man and man is not so considerable, as one man can thereupon claim to himself any benefit which another may or may not pretend as well as he. For us, the strength of the body, the weakest, has strength enough to kill the strongest, either by secret machination or by confederacy with others that are in the same danger as himself. Hobbes points to guile, to machination, or to conspiracy as a human capacity that equalizes us with one another, so that the brute force of the merely strong do not have to rule us. it seems not by coincidence that both of our sets of stories, both of our traditions, are ultimately about political foundations. For instance, in the Greek case, the polis, where all have an equal voice and equal power for office, or the Hebrew nation, where no man takes the place of God. So both of these traditions culminate in some kind of vision of human life where force and violence do not rule. So I now turn to the philosophical tradition. Our mainstream virtue theorists and philosophers do not tend to draw on the lore that I've alluded to, the lore of the evasion of violence or of ancient literary traditions, but rather they draw on the philosophical tradition founded by Plato and by Aristotle. The tradition of the philosophical approach to the virtues is one marked by a principle of unity. Prudence is a necessary condition for all the virtues, and prudence cannot be had without all the others. So there's a mutual reciprocity between virtue, all the other virtues, courage, temperance, etc., and prudence on the other. As a moral psychological state, it is a famously obscure faculty. So anyone can break their head over trying to figure out what Aristotle thinks prudence is in an individual soul. It stands in for the intellectual capacity that grounds the virtues, but somehow it remains distinct from all of them. So it's very hard to understand how there could be this single faculty that's somehow necessary, that's an intellectual faculty that's somehow necessary for all the virtues, and yet is somehow independent of them. But then I think it's extremely difficult. I think if you read literature, you'll see what I mean about how difficult it is to understand what this moral psychological state is like. As I try to draw these two traditions together, the philosophical tradition and these literary traditions, now I've moved from, there's really two, but anyway, okay. Literary tradition, philosophical tradition, that's what we're operating with right now. I have two main theses as I try to bring them together. First, practical wisdom is for Aristotle, essentially a virtue to be exercised in authority. It is a political virtue and a virtue of ruling. And I think I know much less about Aquinas than I do about Aristotle, and I know much less about him than at least 3/4 of this room. But I do get the sense that there's something similar going on. That is, prudence in Aquinas is associated with command, and command is also key to law. Those seem to me roughly analogous to the situation with Aristotle, but I'm not going to claim that what I'm saying applies to Thomas as well. So part of the reason why I think Aristotle's account of prudence is so obscure is that it's been approached as a merely individual moral state instead of as a political, a state connected to a political office. Whether it be, and I mean by authority, being the head of a household, being the head of a family, being a teacher, being the holding office in a city. It doesn't have to be an overlord. But this is the space in which prudence operates in Aristotle. So that's my first thesis, is that practical wisdom for Aristotle is essentially political. Secondly, while the prudence of the literary traditions is the art of survival, and Aristotle would describe this, I think, as the art of living, understood as mere living, the prudence of the philosophical traditions is the art of living well, the arts of cultivating the virtues, of developing human beings to their highest kinds of achievement. These arts involve device and stratagem worthy of the cleverness of Odysseus or King David. In Aristotle's discussion of practical wisdom in Book 6 of the Nicomachean Ethics, he famously distinguishes practical wisdom or phronesis, or prudence, from craftiness or cleverness, depending on the end at which the chosen action aims. So one can be clever on Aristotle's account without goodness, without moral virtue, but goodness is necessary for the virtue of practical wisdom. So I'm going to read out some Aristotle, which is the moment I know this is what you've been waiting for. There's a faculty called cleverness, and this is such as to be able to do the things that tend towards the mark we have set for ourselves and to attain them. Now, if the mark be noble, the cleverness is praiseworthy. But if the mark be bad, the cleverness is deviousness or wickedness. Hence we call even men of practical wisdom clever or devious. Practical wisdom is not the faculty of cleverness, but it does not exist without it. And practical wisdom, the eye of the soul, acquires its formed state not without the aid of virtue, as has been said and is plain. For what is to be done involves a starting point, the end, what is best, whatever it may be. And since this is not evident except to the good man, for wickedness perverts us and causes us to be deceived about the starting points of action. Therefore, it is evident, it's not really that evident, that it is impossible to be practical wise without being good. So in this way, Aristotle distinguishes the virtue of practical wisdom or prudence from the mere cleverness that might belong to thieves or hustlers or deceivers. The true virtue of practical wisdom consists in the ability to procure the human good, the final end of eudaimonia or human flourishing, by deliberating well. He defines it eventually as practical wisdom is a reasoned and true state of capacity to act with regard to the human goods. It's most especially the ability to attain the means to eudaimonia or human flourishing. Aristotle's discussion of wisdom or practical wisdom is rooted in disputes between Socrates and people you might call the immoralists, Thrasymachus, Callicles, and Meno, who each argue that success is won by the use of intelligence to acquire power and the goods that power can get for a person. In each case, in the Platonic dialogues, in different ways, Socrates argues that power without goodness is useless or harmful. So he's foreshadowing Aristotle's claim that cleverness in attaining your end is not the same as virtue or wisdom. In these dialogues, this is Republic 1 or Gorgias or Meno, the reader may be frustrated by the sense that the wicked interlocutors appeal to a kind of lived reality. That is, if you're willing to do anything, it seems like you can actually rise to the top in political office. Whereas Socrates appeals alternately to conceptual truths or to conflicts within the moral framework of his interlocutors. So his treatment is more abstract, and the immoralists are more concrete. Why should it be that prudence requires virtue, or that virtue requires prudence? In what sense are the moral and intellectual virtues united? Since here's one simple way of giving an account of, I think, what Aristotle's thinking. Since the end that all men seek is happiness or eudaimonia, one cannot master the means to the end if one conceives eudaimonia under false conditions. So aiming correctly or incorrectly in a eudaimonistic framework, like the one we're looking at, where being good aims at happiness, that's determined by actual accounts of human flourishing. So here I think we can imagine examples. You have a seasoned operator who rises to the top of, say, the drug trade, only to find his empire collapse under his fingertips, due to the intervention of a rival. The wrong end, that is the wrong conception of eudaimonia, is not decided by divine fiat or by arbitrary appeal to concepts, but it is tested in human experience, even if human experience sometimes must take a long view. The Psalms tell us repeatedly that the wicked man flourishes for a time and then is gone. The Psalms tell us that so often that presumably it's suggesting that we need a reminder, because wicked men often take a very long time to crumble and fall. One other example of the instability of bad ends, of poor conceptions of eudaimonia, appears in Aristotle's work himself in the Politics, and he uses the poignant case of Sparta. This is the rival Greek city-state to Athens. Sparta, on Aristotle's view, seeks virtue, namely especially military courage — Spartans are famous for their army — as a means to military greatness. But military greatness is not actually a containable or achievable end. Their love of honor degenerates into love of wealth, and they end by losing the virtue that they had temporarily marshaled for warlike purposes. Elsewhere, Aristotle describes war as being a kind of unlimited end. That is, if courage in war is your end, then you want to be at war, which is a perverse incentive for a political community. So this was all by way of trying to explain why it might be that there might be a real distinction between cleverness and practical wisdom. That is, the choice of the end, the choice of the conception of happiness, whether that's power, success, wealth, or even a limited kind of virtue in military victory, that's going to determine your success in attaining it. So in attaining, that is, human flourishing or eudaimonia. So you can't get, in some way, you can get cleverness can get you temporary ends, but it can't get you the ultimate end. Because for Aristotle, the ultimate end requires the right kind of training in habits. So the kind of ends I've just sketched sits uneasily with some parts of Aristotle's discussion. Aristotle emphasizes that practical wisdom does not determine the end of action, but only the means to an end. The state or capacity he calls virtue determines the end and is responsible for it. That is, if you ask yourself, oh, okay, so everything depends on my choice of an end, how do I get the right end? Aristotle doesn't think that you can reason your way to it. He thinks that you have to be, unless it's by pure, either it arises by chance or it arises by a certain kind of training or education. So Aristotle emphasizes, so Aristotle emphasizes that he says over and over again, this is one of the ways that his discussion is so difficult, that practical wisdom is only about the means to the end, it's not the end. And then you're wondering, well, then why did the end matter so much in what you were just telling us about how practical wisdom is different from cleverness? So this is a great stumbling block in the study of Aristotle. And I think one way of trying to find a way out of the difficulty is to see that for Aristotle, being virtuous, as I say, involves being brought up in good habits. That is, seeing the right end involves a certain kind of training in proper pleasures. And this is in part a negative education, an education that avoids sensual indulgence in food or drink or sex in such a way that those pleasures would overwhelm our capacity to see what's good for us. It is the hedonistic lifestyle, after all, that draws even brilliant people like Callicles or like Alcibiades to a bad end. So reasoning alone is not sufficient to secure our happiness. It's not sufficient to secure our highest condition. The end has to be fixed in our appetites, desires, and loves. And I think one can find a beautiful connection between love and prudence along these lines. Prudence is, as Aristotle puts it, the eye of the soul. So just as a lover might turn the city upside down, looking for the perfect gift for his beloved, and seeing pieces of it everywhere, the prudent person, the person with practical wisdom, looks for every conceivable way that his end might be achieved, his end of eudaimonia. Here, Odysseus, in some way, there's a touch of Odysseus in a virtuous ruler. Odysseus' love of life and his love for his community at first keeps him alive, and then it permits him to be restored to his household and kingdom. That is, you have to imagine how much he wanted the thing that he ends up getting. And that's why he's able to be so devious and to see so many ways and means to getting that thing. It's the ingenuity of love would not be a bad definition of prudence, I don't think. So his love of Odysseus is a driver of his ingenuity, just as a good ruler or lawgiver's love of virtue drives his careful attention to details of constitutional design or legal constraint. So here I've begun to assume something that contemporary readers of Aristotle have usually missed. So for Aristotle, most primarily, virtue is cultivated in small communities, cities, polises. The purpose of politics and legislation is this cultivation of virtue. Otherwise, Aristotle thinks, and here I'm thinking about the last chapter of the Nicomachean Ethics, otherwise Aristotle thinks that virtue would be merely a matter of chance, with each household living as a law unto itself, like the Cyclops. That's Aristotle's example, not mine. I came by it honestly. This is what Aristotle says. If, as we have said, the man who is to be good must be well trained and habituated, and go on to spend his lifetime in worthy occupations, neither willingly or unwillingly do bad actions, and if this can be brought about if men live in accordance with a sort of reason or right order, if this has force, if this be so, the paternal command, that is, the command of the father in the household, has not the required force, nor compulsive power, but the law does. And the law is a rule proceeding from practical wisdom and from insight. And while people hate men who oppose their impulses, even if they oppose them correctly, the law, in its ordaining of what is good, is not burdensome. So here, Aristotle is giving, in a kind of nutshell, the core of his ethical and political philosophy, which is that the determination of laws in order to make people good is the best and only and central way to bring human beings to the highest level of their achievement. It's also clear to me that Aristotle thinks that cyclopic societies, so the Cyclops gives the law to his own family. He has no broader community in which he belongs. So I think Aristotle thinks that he lives in a cyclopic society, and that he writes his political and ethical theory as an attempt at a corrective. In other words, when Aristotle says virtue makes the goal right, and prudence or practical wisdom the means towards the goal, he's not only imagining a person brought up in good habits by good fortune, say someone like, I imagine Socrates is. How does Socrates get to be so great? It's a really hard question. It seems to be something like luck. His primary interest, all of his fellow citizens seem kind of cruddy, right? That's why they turn against him. Aristotle's primary interest is in a person brought up under good and effective laws which not only aim at virtue, as Aristotle thinks all laws in some way do, but which do so successfully. In this way, prudence and practical wisdom are built into the origins of virtue, the prudence of the lawgiver, as well as to the rulers and teachers that implement the lawgiver's vision. Becoming good for Aristotle, developing the virtue of prudence, involves coming to see the reasoning behind the laws that one is governed by as a youth. The reasoning so I'm thinking about cases where, and it's easiest to see not in say, the laws of the United States. But if you think of a more polis-sized community, so like a college, a university, a company, I think you can, if you're in one, if you've ever been in one that's very well run, was designed by people with practical wisdom, there are reasons why things are done in a particular way that you can reason backwards to, even if you don't ever know the lawgiver. So I'll give you an example. My home college, St. John's, where Carter Sneed also went, just so you know. Very famous place. Okay. We have this lay of customs like using last names in class or not appealing to secondary literature. And no one ever tells you why we do these things, not in my memory anyway. But you can, by being a part of it and by seeing that you're a part of something good, reason your way back into why that law might be the case. And in doing so, one develops one's own virtue of prudence, the prudence of the person who put the whole community together. Okay, I guess we started like 10 minutes late, right? Okay. I'm almost done. I have described a gap, as I see it, between the vivid accounts of prudence and its uses that we find in the ancient literary traditions and the slogans of contemporary virtue theory that say prudence is something unified and requires virtue, that seem to tell us that neither Odysseus nor Abraham were prudent after all, since they made use of deception, and deception implies a vice, and so they can't possibly be good. So I may have made that too implicit previously in the talk, but there's a tension between these two traditions. It's very strong. In one case, you have these heroic people who will do almost anything to succeed, including lying. And on the other, you have this teaching that somehow prudence is the queen of the virtues, absolutely top-notch, and implies all the other virtues, and all the other virtues apply it. And if we take both those things together, they're not consistent. So in the remainder of my talk, the short remainder, very, very short remainder, and very entertaining remainder. Lots of jokes coming, okay? In the remainder of the talk, I make two suggestions as to how this gap might be bridged. And I think it should be obvious, even so far, that my discussion is taking place at a pretty high altitude. So it's more of an indication of the kind of work that really ought to be done, okay, than a fully worked out piece of work itself. So my first suggestion is this, that rather than condemning someone like Odysseus, or certainly Abraham or Jacob, as somehow flawed or bad people, that rather we imagine them as pointing to how enormously difficult it is to survive without a political community. Abraham is a wealthy shepherd among armed bands of thugs, much stronger than him. King David is a king anointed to the same office as his own still living king. Odysseus is a solo traveler making his way across a hostile sea in pursuit of a safe homecoming to the household and city he has not seen for 20 years, and which has become overrun by violent men. So the Odyssey depicts the state of being cityless or stateless in two respects. Not only Odysseus and his sailors lost at sea, but lost at sea and facing every kind of monster and every kind of hostility to life and flourishing. It also depicts, at the same time, the city of Ithaca, Odysseus' home, whose king has been absent for 20 years. The suitors of Odysseus' wife Penelope are thugs. They're devouring the wealth of the king and the city. Penelope plays on their bare adherence to custom by promising to choose one of them when she finishes weaving the burial shroud for Odysseus' father. In a device worthy of her crafty husband, she unweaves the shroud each night to delay indefinitely the moment of crisis. Telemachus, Odysseus' son, and Odysseus devise a plot to retake the throne and rid the house of the thugs. The plot includes extensive deception, for they are grossly outnumbered, and a just claim of rule and ownership on its own carries no weapons. The unity of the virtues, if this suggestion is correct, is a regulative norm achieved only in certain luxurious circumstances, the circumstances of a functioning city. One might protest the case of Socrates, by contrast, who chose to be unjustly executed rather than the clever ruses of escape that his friends offered to him in Plato's Crito. In this respect, Socrates is the model of all subsequent martyrs. Yet for Odysseus to be murdered on the shore by a usurper is not any kind of martyrdom, just as it would be no kind of martyrdom for the powerful tribe of Esau to wipe out the brilliant offspring of Jacob. Even martyrdom, it seems to me, requires some sort of community or some sort of audience to which it makes sense to, for which it can create a kind of living ideal that we can live up to. That brings us to my second suggestion. Aristotle's conception of practical wisdom has been widely misunderstood in recent decades. And now I'm going to clarify something which I said sort of cryptically earlier. The literature as it exists treats Aristotle's practical wisdom as primarily a virtue for solo individuals. For instance, those stranded at sea or bands of shepherds that loose at hostile territory. I think that this view is wrong, and that rather practical wisdom is the virtue, as Aristotle puts it, of a ruler, of someone who holds office, whether that be the office of a head of household, the office in the city, the office of a teacher, the office of a police officer, the office of a dean, etc. And I want to take this brief aside because of where I am that I understand much of this thanks to, I gave a talk here many years ago in the philosophy department on Aristotle's politics, and Alistair McIntyre laid into me, as he was wont to do. And he made some interventions that I have never forgotten and that have shaped my understanding things. So this is, there's a little trace of Alistair in what follows. Aristotle identifies the practical wisdom with the art of politics, and so exhorts the audience in Nicomachean Ethics to put it into practice, put virtue into practice by studying legislation. Aristotle says that even householders with no prospect of rule in their own cities ought to study legislation, ought to study constitutions and how they're put together, how they survive and how they're modified and how they decline, in order to use their authority to bring their household and their associates to greater human excellence and flourishing. Given that the point of politics and legislation for Aristotle is to make people good, phronesis, or practical wisdom, ought also to be understood as the art of making people good, the art of cultivating virtue. That is what the virtue of practical wisdom is. This art might be beautifully transparent in the way I suggested in talking about how one might reason backward from the rules one lives under to the ways in which they produce your good. They might be beautifully transparent the way that Neoptolemus is with Philoctetes at the end of the play, where he attempts to point out that the hero's true good lies in friendship with him and returning to Troy. Yet even there, in the case of the Philoctetes, transparency is not sufficient. A god or a deceiver must intervene. How does Aristotle's ruler then differ from the aspiring tyrants like Callicles or Thrasymachus or Meno? It's the identity between the good of the ruler, eudaimonia as the exercise of virtue, and the good of the ruled. That is, in part because virtue is a condition for the holding of practical wisdom, and virtue is the thing that the lawgiver cultivates. You end up with this kind of identity in the end of the individual and the community. So it's a bit like being a ruler in Aristotle is a bit like being a farmer, only how do I put it exactly? You're a farmer that's somehow identical with the field that you're sowing, or something like that, something crazy like that. Okay. Let me think about that and come back to it later. That doesn't make any sense right now. As Aristotle continually emphasizes in the Politics, the best form of government is one where citizens rule and are ruled in turn. In such a structure, the laws and practices of the community administered by the middle-aged train the young in virtue. When they become older, they too take up office and rule and take responsibility for the cultivation of the young. The cross-generational reproduction of virtue through law is, I think, meant as a kind of reproduction, like something natural. The exercise of an activity rather than merely technical art or craft. Virtue or happiness must be understood from the inside. That is, you can't, it's like you saying something like you can't be a farmer unless you are a plant yourself. That's even worse, isn't it? This metaphor is just going to die. I should just leave it to die. In this way, the means and materials of virtue become visible or even obvious to the virtuous ruler. The virtuous ruler knows why the rules and customs matter. By experience, in light of the lived reality of the city's flourishing, the flourishing which he loves and cherishes. So let me just say something before I close about how rules and customs cultivate virtue, just so it's a little clear why I'm comparing that with ingenuity or device or lack of transparency. So these examples are from Aristotle's Politics. One example is the best ordered democracy. It gives the offices to the rich who love honor, and it gives the power to audit the officers to the poor who are content without honor but who don't want to be exploited. And what Aristotle says is that in this structure, everyone gets something of what they want, and no one gets too much. And each part of the city holds the other in some kind of order. Now that strikes me as being a kind of device. It may be transparent, that is, you may be able to see why your city is good, but it is nonetheless a device, an exercise of a kind of ingenuity. Likewise, Aristotle says that private property is necessary, not because it's somehow a matter of natural right, but because without it, people's appetites can't stay in the right order. So you need, in order to have the virtues of generosity and things of that kind, you need to actually have property to be able to give away. So your love of money has to be properly ordered by a virtue, and to do that, you actually have to have some, in order to have some wealth or some property to do that. Again, a device. In the city that Aristotle describes in Politics 7, each citizen has 2 plots of land, one near the border and one near the city, so as to avoid conflict between the border dwellers and the city dwellers. Once again, a device. So one feature of practical wisdom that it shares with cleverness is a type of ingenuity. Let me just say something in the end about why this matters in case you've been bored by both the literary details and the philosophical details. This part is for you. It's all going to be worth it, all your suffering. Why is this aspect of Aristotle's thinking, why has Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, been treated as a treatise about the virtue of individuals without communities? Why has this mistake been so stubbornly kept to for so long? It seems to me pretty clear. It's because we're liberals who, by habit, who live in a cultural world where one's moral life is seen as governed almost exclusively by individual choice. We can scarcely imagine a social world where to lead a public life always implied to exercise authority as a householder, a citizen, a magistrate, or an officer. Yet this leaves us justly cynical about the virtues of authority figures. They seem to be mere power seekers. We live in a large ignorance of the virtues exercised in authority, and this affects our parenting as well as our governing of small institutions. And I will add that our current breed of post-liberals, that is, these are people who believe that virtue and politics should be closely united, they seem to believe that law and truth, law and the moral truth ought to be identified in some way. So far as I can see, they seem not to think far beyond making bad things illegal. And this shows a gross ignorance, I think, of the virtue of ingenuity of practical wisdom, which seeks to cultivate virtue and avoid vice by ingenious structuring that preserves human autonomy, and not simply by banning things that are bad or honoring things that are good. To me, it seems obvious that liberalism is the ship on which we can best survive and avoid tyrannical forms of oppression. Its defects need not be corrected from the top down. Rather, they are best corrected, as I believe, from the bottom up, in the formation of families, networks of families, communities of various kinds, small institutions such as companies, businesses, organizations, nonprofits, schools, and colleges. To build and govern such institutions, the great virtue of practical wisdom is very much needed. The virtue of practical wisdom that our literary traditions illuminate, and as our philosophical traditions clarify. Thank you.
Okay, friends, we have about 10 minutes for questions. Let's see. Let's start with an inside baseball great books kind of question that I've been wondering about. Thinking about the Cyclops as self-law, autonomos, right? He's a law unto himself. I wonder how you might think about Antigone relative to the Cyclops, because she's also described as she's a law unto herself, autonomos, right? So I just wonder if, clearly there's a difference, but it seems like Antigone herself is, she's enmeshed in a kind of political community that requires her to act in a way that is counter to it. So I'd just be curious of how the discussion of phronesis fits into a character like that.
I'm not sure. I don't think I've thought clearly about that. My sense would be, this is my first off-the-cuff answer. You can tell me if it's wrong, or someone can. The Antigone is a figure a bit like Socrates. So you can be a person who has an understanding of some basic piece of human flourishing or human value that needs to be protected, and you could be living under a government which does not recognize that, or under a ruler who does not recognize that. Nothing I'm saying is meant to rule that out. So I think the thing about the Cyclops, and what I think Aristotle is seeing about the Cyclops, is that it's a whole society where each one gives a law to their own household. So it's not just a matter of being a single person who gives a law to oneself, or who finds a law that is being neglected by the community. It's where there basically is no common community which has a law. So that was what I meant to appeal to when I appealed to the Cyclops.
Wonderful. One of the things that I found interesting too is, so I teach in a great books program here at Notre Dame, and one of our founding documents from the 1950s appeals to Odysseus, not because he's crafty and wily necessarily, but because he's synoptic. He's able to look and sort of see all at once. He can see the parts and the wholes, scan the room, understand what he ought to do. And so in a way, seeing parts and wholes in their relation and the capacity to make a prudential judgment about life in the world seems to me as a kind of a model for liberal arts students. So I wonder if how you see this relationship between phronesis, practical wisdom, and all the goods of a liberal or great books education.
Right. Well, in some ways, it's in the back of my mind. I mean, one thing I didn't talk about, because there was obviously really a bit too much in the talk, but the end, eudaimonia, or human flourishing for Aristotle, is contemplation. That means that the end that the political person, the lawmaker, is supposed to have in mind is contemplation. And I don't know why I'm saying this with emphasis, because I feel like it's something that my colleagues, scholars, don't understand. But you may all understand it, because you might be wiser people who've read more carefully. Liberal arts are one of the means by which we cultivate human flourishing, and the central core of human flourishing, namely its contemplative aspect. And that means that we need to hold that end in view and pursue it and love it. And I think the necessity there is different. The way that end functions is different at different levels of authority. So it might be at the national level, what you just need is to make that possible, to permit it, not to interfere with it. But on the level of an institution, of course, one has to have that end in view and design one's institution so that that is the central activity that's going on. And that's something which very few institutions are doing. And I don't think any of them are doing it well. So that's definitely part of the background motivation which is driving the talk.
Thank you. Okay, let's go to some of the questions from the audience. We have one from Christopher Gradecki, SJ, Notre Dame PhD student in theology, about to defend his dissertation next week. So good luck to Chris. He says, Thomas defines prudence as the height of virtue because it is the virtue of prudence fulfilling Aristotle's definition of virtue, doing the right thing in the right place at the right time in the right way. Prudence as cleverness seems to be ruled out by Socrates when he says it is never right to do wrong. Why should someone pursue virtue if prudence as cleverness is merely the weak overcoming strong in a might makes right ethic, like Thrasymachus in the Republic?
Yes, that is the kind of question I was anticipating, although and tried to in some way forestall, but I may not have done it quite successfully. My thought is that we can, one way of putting it might be this, I didn't put it in the talk. We can hold to this ideal of prudence, which Aquinas, following Aristotle, thinks is united with all the virtues, following Socrates, reciprocally implying all the other virtues and all the other virtues implying it, such that it is incompatible with wrongdoing, including deception. We can hold that as an ideal while recognizing that that it requires that virtue to be regularly cultivated and exercised requires a community. And these stories that we have, like of Odysseus or the patriarchs, they are not stories of people who are living in a community. These are of people who are thrown out in the wilderness, threatened on every side by violence. And that seems like a very important distinction to keep in mind. So the stories that I was describing loving about, avoiding crime or violence, right? They're ingenuity exercised to avoid violence. And ideally, they don't involve any deception or wrongdoing. That's why I like the idea of, teasing the Nazi at your doorstep or whatever, like playing jokes on him. But because then according to the old hackneyed philosophy example, you don't have to actually lie to him. But I think for us to have a virtue theory, an account of the human virtues that's really alive to the whole range of human experience, it seems to me that we have to think more carefully about these kinds of circumstances and to take into account these traditions. Because part of what motivated the talk was a sense that if we cling to these things in a way that almost becomes a slogan, that is, prudence, no wrongdoing is compatible with the virtue of prudence, then what are we doing when we love these stories about people who play tricks in order to get out of scrapes? So what I'm gesturing towards is a way of maintaining the beauty and the strength of the philosophical and the theological traditions while being more alive to the kinds of varieties of human experience that shape all of the stories that we love and shape in some ways our reality. So I'm trying to carve a midway path between, I hope that helps with at least to explain what motivates me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I think we just have about a minute left, so there's so many good questions. I wish we had more time, but there's drinking to do.
We can't just take a little more time.
Well, maybe we'll do two more. How about that? We have a question from Joshua Hayes from Princeton. He says, it seems that the idea of prudence being the ingenuity of love still necessitates practical skills. Not unlike Odysseus's cunning, this might not be pursued in the same straightforward way that something like honesty might be. Can individuals be born with a higher capacity for virtues such as prudence that cannot be followed on a perfectly straight path? If not, what are some practical suggestions you can leave us with to form a deeper familiarity with this ingenuity?
So it's funny. I was talking for a long time with Philip Munoz, who I think is not here, but he was really pushing me on this question. He was like, "No, it can't be taught, and no, maybe you're born with it, and maybe you're not born with it." And what I suspect, what I was arguing to him, and what I still suspect is that wherever that capacity for intense love and devotion comes from, I don't know whether it's innate or whether it's learned. I think it can certainly be partly learned, even if it is partly innate. Wherever that comes from, that is the source of that ability to find devices in seeing what's in front of you and find the way out of it. And I'm thinking about, I lived in Madonna House, which is a religious community which lives by poverty, and those people were ingenious. Okay, poverty made them ingenious. So there was this one guy who built a pool table by putting cups and cardboard on the end of a ping pong table, and then I don't even remember why the cues. I mean, didn't work. That one didn't work very well. But the one that worked better was he made his own Zamboni out of pipes and like a pot that melted snow, and you could see him every morning out, the true Canadian, out there like clearing the ice rink with this thing that he'd made from various random crap that had been lying around. Why? Because that guy was Canadian and he loved the ice, he loved hockey, he was not going to live without it. And it was his determination to have it that made everything look like an instrument that could be a piece of a Zamboni. So I don't know where that capacity comes from. Like I say, I think our vision of it as being something which is somehow innate is in a bit shaped by the fact that it's not. We live in a cyclopic world where these things aren't cultivated. I think if we lived in communities where the virtues were cultivated, and if we're lucky enough to be in such a community, then I think it doesn't look quite so strange that people can achieve all kinds of things. So I think there's a kind of illusion that's created by living in a liberal atomistic community like ours.
Thank you. Okay, for our final question, an anonymous question, someone's asked, human flourishing and common good have become popular buzzwords when it comes to discussions of virtue and ethics. Where do you think this language falls short, and how can we show the proper depth in what those phrases really represent? So instead of being thrown around as empty sets, human flourishing, common good, how can we reclaim the depth of that language?
I would say that the depth of, and I'm very sympathetic to the question, and I feel convicted because I use the word human flourishing a lot without describing what I meant by it. But I do think that it's the use of our imaginations in tandem with our philosophical ability that can give those things depth. It's the use of literature, film, reflection on real life. It's reflecting on one's own experiences, especially in communities which have worked well and ones that have worked badly. This is how those things can have flesh put on them. So I think I'm sympathetic with the questioner in that I do think that these things become flattened out and empty, and it's one of the things I'm very concerned about. But I think the answer is really to seek things that are not merely philosophical, to really seek to use our full imaginations to imagine what these things would concretely look at. And that's also what I think the virtue of prudence actually entails. It entails finding concrete means to concrete ends. It's not something that we made up, like it's not something in a book. It's real, it's just very rare. So you have to look for it and try to figure out how we can build things in an environment where it's not very hospitable to that kind of building.
Thank Zena for her insightful remarks here. Beautiful job. Thank you so much. So friends, we are almost at the end of our time together, almost at the end of our 25th annual fall conference. Before we go, I do have just a few thank yous. For all of our speakers and our guests, especially my friends Carter and Lee Sneed here in the front row for joining us this weekend, and without whom this event would not have been possible. Thank you so much to Carter for all his work in building the center. Also like to thank all of the event, AV, catering, and janitorial staff who have kept our conference running so smoothly these last 3 days. Special thank you to Amber Kirk, to Lisa Vervinkt, Angela Leachman, and all their teams who helped us pull off yet another amazing conference. I'd like to thank our army of Soren Fellow volunteers, and of course, the dedicated staff for their diligent work putting on this conference. I used to think Carter was hyperbolizing when he said the greatest staff in the history of the world, but I know now he was telling the God's honest truth. So thanks especially to Margaret McManaway, to Brooke Tranton, and Justin Patricic for all their hard work. They really did make it all look so easy and effortless, but it really is a tremendous amount of work to pull together hundreds of presenters, 1,000 attendees, and keeping all the logistical things running smoothly. So we will begin our reception here in just a minute, but I do want to remind everyone that The Pillar will be recording a live podcast over at Legends beginning right at 10 p.m. This will be our last event of the conference. Everyone's welcome. You're free to go over early if you'd like to grab a seat. And yes, your Saturday night drink tickets will be good at Legends. So I've heard JD, Ed, and the Pillar team have a really great event in store. Games, guests, prizes, y'all are really in for a treat. So one last time, my most sincere thank you to all for joining us. We look forward to seeing many of you here again next year for another wonderful conference together. Thanks so much.